Welcome back to Wellness Wednesday on All Sides. I'm your host, Ann Fisher. Nearly 1 in 10 U.S. children have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, according to 2016 data from the Centers for Disease Control. The tools used to diagnose ADHD, however, don't always capture the nuances of the disorder. Computer simulations may help clinicians get a better read on the best course of treatment for kids with ADHD. That was the focus of a new research review conducted by researchers at Ohio State and published in the journal Psychological Bulletin. Nadia Ging-Jehli is a doctoral candidate in computational psychiatry at Ohio State. She led the team. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ann.
Okay, so ADHD presents in many different ways for starters, depending on the personality of the person, I would imagine. But what are the main symptoms? What are the overarching, everybody agrees that's a red flag?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So by definition of the statistical manual that is used to diagnose ADHD, it's something very special to that disorder, that it is a disorder of exclusion. So before someone can be diagnosed with ADHD, the clinician or the psychiatrist needs to exclude all other possibilities for the patient. And ADHD is defined as having symptoms that significantly affect multiple different settings, and those symptoms are inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity.
Yeah, and they're not always, we always say ADHD, but they're not always presented together.
Exactly. That's exactly also something that we would like to point out more in our review article that we have just published. When we think about ADHD, what usually comes first to our mind is someone that is like a kid in school that does excessively talk to others, that doesn't remain seated, and that gets into trouble because of his behavior.
And a lot of times it could be the exact opposite.
Exactly. So it could also be a child that is like daydreaming and that feels her or himself in like a foggy state and has a hard time to pay attention. And often those children struggle kind of through the entire elementary school and middle school until they eventually seek help. And many people, and what is a little bit sad is that many children who are untreated often develop depression or other disorders.
How is ADHD or ADD diagnosed now? My recollection is it's like 1,000 questions you have to answer as a parent.
Yes, so there are different approaches, but overall, usually it is composed of like two elements. One is questions that have to be answered by parents and usually also by children. So there are like two different sides because usually, you know, we ourselves see ourselves different than other people do. And so we usually include parent and children questions. And in addition to that, we usually use clinical interviews. So the clinician is inviting the parent and the kid to their office and they complete an interview together.
Your research looked at 50 studies of cognitive tests for ADHD and how they might be improved by 3 common types of computational models. So first of all, when we talk about the cognitive test, that's just how the brain is working, just to see how the brain is responding to questions?
So there is also something that we kind of point out in our article. It's not really a common ground yet that you are asking a really good question, and people use different definitions for what they think about when they say a task. And those tasks, we need to go back a little bit in history why we do have those tasks, because I just told you, like, we use interviews and questionnaires, and people may think, well, why are there now suddenly tasks? There has been a movement that we would like to kind of rule out that we misdiagnose children. And that's why we use those tasks as an additional objective measures. And some of the tasks are administered in conjunction with measures such as electroencephalogram that measures the brain activity.
Okay.
And there you are right. Those tasks, in addition with these neural measures, are used to actually see the biological components. But then there are also tasks that are pure behavioral tasks. So people are invited into a laboratory setting, and then they are asked to do a cognitive task on a computer. By a very common task, for instance, is the continuous performance task, where children are asked, they are presented with a stream of letters, and whenever the letter is a vowel, they are asked to press the button, and whenever the letter is a consonant, they are asked to refrain pressing a button. Mm-hmm. And those tasks are here. Is that task that I just mentioned is used because it is widely assumed that it measures inhibition control. And with our latest computational models, where we simulate how we get to the behavior of within such a task, actually kind of shed some doubt on that assumption.
Kids and adults, one of the things I've heard over the years when I interview experts on this issue, and we get callers in as well, say they're filling out the application, or not the application, but filling out the questionnaire for their child, and they say, "That's me." They start to superimpose themselves on it, and that's kind of what you're talking about, how people can go through well into their life not realizing that that's what they have. And I guess I'm wondering, are there degrees of ADD and ADHD, and does the testing suss that out?
Exactly. That's a really good question. So I personally believe that there is a spectrum of ADHD, and there is also ongoing literature that compares what if we assume that ADHD is a category by itself, so there is not really a degree in severity, and what is when we assume that ADHD is a dimensional disorder. So there are some individuals, every one of us has from time to time lapses of attention or impulsive acts, but there is really a clinical threshold when it becomes dysfunctional, and in such a way that it affects many settings, like going to work or doing some sport or going to school. And with our models, we also find evidence for this, I call it dimensional perspective of the disorder. And the current movement of the Psychiatric Association is to actually find possibilities to quantify to what degree does someone suffer from those symptoms?
And in what way? So they may respond to different therapies, and given the kind of buffet of medications out there now, different medications differently, right?
Exactly. And what is also very interesting is that, up to date now, when someone has been diagnosed with an ADHD, the real struggle just begins, because there are so many different treatment options. And what usually the clinician or the psychiatrist is doing is just to try with trial and error, find the right treatment. And that can be very bothersome for the patient. And many of them actually are getting frustrated and also lose hope. And with a better understanding that we do hope can computational modeling add on, we may be able to kind of guide that process of finding the right treatment.
And then you mentioned earlier sort of the comorbidity of depression, and some people have wondered, well, maybe treat the depression first, and not worry about the ADHD or the ADD yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is not a universal law someone can apply. It's really on an individual basis. And I think, so my premise, or why I strongly stand for computational psychiatry is, your previous listener said something very interesting when you were talking about nutrition and depression. Namely, she said people's choices are also a problem, how people make choices, what kind of food they eat. And And I think that's something that kind of resonates within me, because I do believe that individuals with ADHD or with depression, often they are also helped with, if they can understand how do they make decisions and how could they achieve better decisions. And if we find like possibilities to treat with cognitive behavioral therapies components in their decision process that is like dysfunctional, then they are already helped with a lot.
It's
and
empowering to them.
Excuse me?
It empowers them to do it.
Yes, exactly. And I think someone with ADHD, comorbid depression may show a different a different characteristic of how they make a decision than someone who has only ADHD or someone who has only depression. So that's why I think we need to first understand where does the problem occur? Do they daydream? Are they impulsive? Or is it more a matter of fact that they have problems with getting motivated to start something, to start a task or start an activity? And if we find the reasons behind problems, then we can target those specific sources.
So you're thinking of computational models not just to identify and diagnose ADD or ADHD, but also to treat it.
Yes, it's more like a method to find the right treatment.
Okay.
It's not a treatment by itself.
Okay. And can you give me an example of how a computational model would take you to that next step of finding a treatment?
Yes. So it's actually like the really latest research that I am conducting at OSU in collaboration also with the psychiatric department. So to back up a little bit, many children with ADHD do not respond sufficiently to medication. So it's about 1/3 that do not respond to medication. And neurofeedback has been suggested as a really, really helpful treatment. And the latest research that was conducted by Dr. Arnold at Ohio State was one of the largest neurofeedback treatments. And it showed that children were assigned to like getting active, real neurofeedback. And some children were assigned to like getting shame neurofeedback, which was like a pre-recorded neurofeedback from a different child, unrelated different child. And so they found that they could help some of the children, but not all of them. And now the question, of course, the burning question for clinicians and psychiatrists and also patients is, well, how can we assess before someone starts the treatment? Because neurofeedback is pretty intense. One needs to go in 3 times a week over a long period of time. So it's costly in terms of money, but also in terms of time. Mm-hmm. So we need to find out which child could best benefit from it. And our latest research shows that if we let children perform a cognitive task in the beginning before they start the treatment, okay, depending on how they are doing on that task, and we assess that with our computational modeling, we can predict to what degree they benefit from neurofeedback. And that's like the next step that we are about to go deep into how computational modeling can benefit clinicians.
Instead of going into cognitive therapy blindly, this gives you some guidance about who might respond well to it and whether it's worth the investment to go forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
exactly. And another example is also, we know that like there are different types of medication. So for some children, it's very helpful to have a stimulant with that affect certain circuits in the brain. But then we also know that people, for instance, with anxiety do not respond that well to those medications. And so the thing is really, we found that out with like observing the responses of patients, but with computational modeling, we can actually get at the source why this is the case. And we can kind of understand, if we take a medication, how does it affect our cognition? How do we start to perceive the world in a different way? And I think that is very important also if we think about those who have comorbid depression. We know that they are usually a little bit more tempted to process information negatively, mm-hmm, but how does that work? What does it mean if we process? Somewhere there must be a judgment that gets added on to the information that comes from our outside environment. And there it's where computational modeling can help us to go and see inside the circuits of the brain why they behave the way they do.
Nadia, I don't know where you're from, but you're not from the United States, I can tell. And
yes.
I'm interested in your opinion on what the people think that children in the U.S. are overdiagnosed with ADHD or ADD. I started the whole thing out 1 in 10. That's not the case around the world. What is your sense about why that is? And is it a fallback position, a convenient fallback for people, and that's why they get overdiagnosed?
I think so first of all, I'm from Switzerland,
okay.
and I believe that we have the same issue as the US. So
okay.
There are also some critiques that kind of tell people that ADHD would not exist, or we have many people who tried to get the diagnosis to get the medication because they are performance enhancements.
Yeah.
And so it's very frustrating for those who actually do have ADHD to join the conversation and hear about those things. And I think it's also because there is so much misunderstanding of what ADHD is about. If we really just consider the child that is fidgety in the chair and that kind of needs to have temper outbursts in order to accept that they do have ADHD, then we miss all the others who are daydreaming and shy or introverted. And I have a hard time to join this discussion with rational arguments, as long as we do not really have a clear definition of what do we understand when we talk about ADHD, and what do we do in order to get a good diagnosis. I think everyone would agree with me that we need to have better testing procedures. We need to have standards. We need to find a setting where we can test individuals with the same measures, and there it's where we will gain confidence in our diagnosis, or in or to fight also overdiagnoses.
Nadia Ging-Jehli is a doctoral candidate in computational psychiatry at Ohio State. Her research seeks to find better ways to tailor treatments for psychiatric conditions such as ADHD and ADD. And I thank you so much for your time today. Best wishes.
Thank you so much, Ann.
More Wellness Wednesdays coming up, so stay with us. This is All Sides with Ann Fisher on 89.7 NPR News.